A superstitious passenger refuses to set foot in cabin 13. No one could have foreseen that it would end in murder. Welcome to Baker Street Riddles. Today, we set sail across the Mediterranean with Hercule Poirot in the cabin 13 mystery. You're like family to me, and I'd love to know where in the world are you tuning in from today. I always enjoy reading your comments, so grab your favorite drink, get comfy, and let's dive into a classic Christie-style whodunit, Hercule Poirot and the Cabin 13 Mystery. Chapter 1. A Matter of Superstition. I have often reflected that it is the most trivial of incidents that lead to the most extraordinary of consequences. Had Mr. Jonathan Fraser not been a man of pronounced superstitious tendencies, had the purser been less accommodating, had Poirot and I chosen another vessel for our return to England, well, Colonel Marcus Radley might be alive today. We were 3 days out from Alexandria on the SS Mesopotamia. Poirot had been engaged in a trifling matter at the British Embassy, and I had accompanied him partly to revisit Egypt, and partly because my old friend suggested that desert air would benefit my health after a bout of influenza. That afternoon, I observed a commotion near the purser's office. A tall gentleman in an expensive suit gesticulated wildly. "I absolutely refuse. I cannot and will not occupy cabin 13. Surely you must have some other accommodation." The purser dabbed at his brow. "I assure you, Mr. Fraser, there is nothing wrong with cabin 13. It is identical to the other first-class cabins. It is not a question of quality, sir, but of number. 13. I am not a man who takes unnecessary risks." I smiled at this display of superstition. "Something amuses you, mon ami." Poirot appeared beside me, mustaches freshly waxed to perfection. "Just a passenger making a fuss about cabin 13, I explained. "Superstitious nonsense." Poirot tapped his temple. "Ah, but the superstitions, Hastings, they reveal much about the human mind, n'est-ce pas?" The purser's voice rose again. "Very well, Mr. Fraser. We do have one unoccupied first-class cabin. I can move you to cabin 17. Fraser's shoulders relaxed. "Yes, that would be quite satisfactory. I thought no more of it until dinner." Poirot and I had been assigned to the captain's table with Colonel and Mrs. Radley, Miss Sophia Papadopoulos, and Lady Patricia Westbrook. The colonel sat ramrod straight, iron gray hair cropped close, while his wife, at least 20 years his junior, possessed striking beauty. Her eyes darted repeatedly to a young officer at the next table. Miss Papadopoulos had the olive complexion of someone who spent long hours under the Egyptian sun, and Lady Westbrook's ample bosom displayed an impressive collection of jewels. "Just returned from Cairo," the colonel announced. "The Egyptian government presented me with a token of appreciation for services rendered during the war." "How delightful," murmured Lady Westbrook, adjusting a substantial diamond at her throat. "What form did this token take?" "A ceremonial dagger, ancient design, gold and silver inlay presented by the minister himself." Miss Papadopoulos's fingers tightened around her water-glass. "How fortunate to receive such a treasure." "You must show it to us," said Lady Westbrook. "Perhaps I shall," the colonel replied, "though I keep it secure in my cabin. One can't be too careful with valuables at sea." The purser approached and bent to speak quietly to the colonel about a change in his accommodation. With visible annoyance, the colonel excused himself. His wife barely acknowledged his departure. When he returned, he brushed at his sleeve. "Apparently, I am being moved to another cabin. Some nonsense about a plumbing issue. "How inconvenient," said Lady Westbrook. "I trust they are providing compensation. An upgrade, they say." "Larger cabin, with a better view," he laughed. "Cabin 13, of all things. Some passenger refused to stay there out of superstition. Load of rubbish, if you ask me. I've faced enemy fire. I'm hardly going to be troubled by a number." I caught Poirot's eye. A familiar gleam had appeared. His little gray cells were engaged. During a lull in conversation, Miss Papadopoulos leaned forward. "You were in the Valley of the Kings, I understand, Colonel?" "Briefly. More of a tourist than a scholar. Yet you came away with several interesting souvenirs, I believe." The table fell silent. The Colonel's knife paused mid-cut. "All acquired legitimately, I assure you." "Of course," she said, though her tone suggested otherwise. After dinner, Poirot suggested a turn around the deck. The night had wrapped the ship in velvety darkness. "What did you make of our dinner companions?" he asked. "Interesting mix," I replied. "The Colonel seems decent enough. Military type, bit full of himself. His wife is considerably younger, and I'd say not entirely devoted. And Miss Papadopoulos? You observed the exchange. Rather pointed, wasn't it? Something about souvenirs. You think the Colonel might have helped himself to artifacts he shouldn't have." As we rounded a corner, we nearly collided with the ship's steward, a thin man with a sallow complexion, carrying a small valise and a jacket belonging to Colonel Radley. "Pardon me, gentlemen," he said. "Moving the Colonel's things to his new cabin, I take it?" "Yes, sir." "Just the last few items." He hesitated. "Would either of you happen to know the time?" My watch has stopped. Poirot consulted his pocket watch. "It is precisely 9:27. "Thank you, sir." The steward, Hawkins, according to his name tag, hurried away. In the smoking room we found Captain Geoffrey Barton enjoying a cigar. "You served with Colonel Radley, I believe?" Poirot inquired. The muscles in Barton's jaw tightened. "Yes, in Egypt and Palestine. Radley commanded our regiment for a time. You are not, perhaps, the greatest of friends? Let's just say the Colonel and I have different recollections of certain events during the campaign." He tapped ash from his cigar. "But that's all water under the bridge now." Our conversation was interrupted by a commotion outside. The door burst open, and a white-faced steward appeared. "Is there a doctor here?" "Colonel Radley has been found in his cabin, stabbed." Poirot was immediately on his feet. I followed as he hurried toward the first-class cabins. A small crowd had gathered outside cabin 13. The ship's captain, recognizing Poirot, motioned us forward. "Monsieur Poirot, this is most distressing. Perhaps you would." "Of course, Captain, if I may be of assistance." The cabin revealed a scene of disorder. A chair lay overturned. Glass fragments from a shattered water carafe glinted on the floor, and the bed covers were twisted. There, sprawled across the bed, lay Colonel Radley, his white shirt front stained crimson. Protruding from his chest was an ornate dagger, the ceremonial weapon he had mentioned at dinner. The ship's doctor looked up. "Nothing to be done. He's been dead for at least half an hour." Poirot surveyed the scene methodically. "Who discovered the body?" "I did, sir," said Hawkins, now almost gray. "I came to ask if everything was satisfactory with the new cabin, and found him like this." "You touched nothing? Only his wrist to check for a pulse, and the door handle." Poirot nodded, and began examining the cabin. He knelt and reached under the bed, extracting something which he slipped into his pocket. "We'll have to wireless ahead, and have the authorities meet us at the next port," the captain said. "Which is?" I inquired. "Malta." We dock tomorrow afternoon. Then we have until then to uncover the truth, said Poirot. With your permission, Captain, I would like to investigate this matter. I was about to request your help. This is most distressing. Murder aboard my ship. I shall require a complete list of passengers and crew, access to all areas of the vessel, and the cooperation of your officers. You shall have it all. Outside the cabin, the night had grown darker, clouds obscuring the stars. A distant rumble of thunder presaged the storm to come. Poirot's face showed the focused concentration I knew so well. The puzzle had been presented, and Hercule Poirot would not rest until every piece had found its proper place. Chapter 2. The morning after I awoke the following morning to find the sea considerably less calm than it had been the previous day. The SS Mesopotamia pitched and rolled with a rhythmic motion that might have been soothing under different circumstances. As it was, the events of the previous night had left me with a distinct uneasiness that had nothing to do with the motion of the vessel. Poirot, when I joined him for breakfast, appeared perfectly untroubled by either the ship's movement or the murder. He sat at a small table near the window, immaculately dressed as always, his egg-shaped head bent over a cup of hot chocolate. "Ah, Hastings, you have slept well, I trust." "Not particularly," I admitted, signaling to a passing steward. "Hard to sleep soundly with a murderer aboard." Poirot's mustache twitched slightly. "Most of the passengers, I suspect, share your difficulty. Observe." I glanced around the dining saloon. It was noticeably less crowded than the previous morning, and those who had ventured forth spoke in hushed tones, casting furtive glances at their fellow travelers. The captain's table, where we had dined with Colonel Radley and the others the night before, remained conspicuously empty. "The news has spread, I see," I said, buttering a piece of toast, with more concentration than the task required. "Like the oil on the water," Poirot agreed. "But observe, if you please, the table by the door." I followed his gaze to where Mrs. Radley sat alone, dressed in black, a cup of untouched coffee before her. Her face was pale but composed, her auburn hair arranged with the same careful attention as the previous evening. "The grieving widow," I murmured. "Indeed. And yet she has chosen to appear in the public dining room rather than have her breakfast served in her cabin." Before I could respond, Miss Lemon appeared at our table. Poirot's secretary had accompanied us on this journey to assist with correspondence relating to his recent case. Efficient as always, she carried a notebook and wore an expression of brisk competence. "I've compiled the information you requested, Mr. Poirot," she said, placing a neatly typed sheet of paper beside his plate. A complete list of the first-class passengers, their cabin numbers, and their stated reasons for traveling. "Excellent, Miss Lemon. And the crew members who had access to the first-class cabins?" "On the second page, sir, along with their duties and schedules." Poirot examined the list with approval. "You are the model of efficiency, Miss Lemon. There is one more task I would ask of you. Would you be so good as to engage Mrs. Radley in conversation? Perhaps express condolences and observe her responses. The feminine touch it may elicit confidences that would not be shared with Poirot." Miss Lemon nodded and moved away toward the widow's table. I raised an eyebrow at Poirot. "Starting with the wife, are you? Isn't that a bit obvious?" "The obvious must never be overlooked, my friend. Besides, it is a courtesy call. The official questioning will come later." He tapped the passenger list. "But first, I think we should pay a visit to our superstitious friend, Mr. Fraser." We found Fraser in the ship's library, a book open but unread on his lap, as he stared out at the rolling waves. He started visibly when Poirot introduced himself. The detective. "I have read about your cases, of course." Fraser's thin fingers fidgeted with his watch chain. "Dreadful business about Colonel Radley. I can't help feeling responsible, perhaps," Poirot suggested gently. Fraser's head jerked up. "How did you know?" "It's irrational, I'm aware. But if I hadn't insisted on changing cabins, he wouldn't have been in cabin 13, and perhaps the murderer would have found another opportunity," I interjected. "Quite so," Poirot agreed. "Tell me, Mr. Fraser, why such fear of the number 13? A flush crept up Fraser's neck. "A family tragedy. My brother died on the 13th of March, in a room numbered 13, at 13 minutes past the hour. Coincidence, the rational mind says, but since then his voice trailed off. You knew Colonel Radley before last night? No, not at all. I had never met the man before. I saw him at dinner. And after dinner, where did you go?" Fraser frowned. "I retired early. The motion of the ship doesn't agree with me. I took a sedative and was asleep by 9. Can anyone confirm this? The steward, who brought me a hot water bottle. Perkins, I believe his name was around 8:30. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you, Mr. Fraser. You have been most helpful." As we left the library, I glanced at Poirot. "Well, do you believe him?" "There is no reason not to. But it is still early, Hastings. We have many threads to follow." Our next call was to Captain Barton, whom we found on the boat deck, pacing back and forth with a restless energy. The wind had picked up, sending spindrift across the deck. "Monsieur Poirot," he acknowledged, his face taut. "I suppose you want to question me about Radley." "If you would be so kind." Poirot leaned against the railing, seemingly untroubled by the spray that occasionally swept across the deck. "You mentioned last night that you and the Colonel had differences." Barton's lips compressed into a thin line. "That's putting it mildly. Perhaps you would care to elaborate." The captain extracted a cigarette from a silver case and attempted to light it, the wind extinguishing 3 matches before he succeeded. It was during the Palestine campaign. I led a night raid on a Turkish position. High-risk operation, but my men pulled it off. Got valuable intelligence, too. He exhaled smoke that was immediately whipped away by the wind. Radley was my commanding officer. He took credit for planning the whole thing, got a commendation while I got nothing. "A bitter pill to swallow," I commented. "Damned right it was." Barton's knuckles whitened around the ship's rail. "But not worth killing him for, if that's what you're thinking. That was years ago. And yet the two of you find yourselves on the same ship," Poirot observed. "A coincidence." "Entirely. I'm returning from leave in Alexandria. Had no idea he'd be aboard until I saw him at dinner." "Where were you between 9 and 10 o'clock last evening?" Barton's jaw tightened. "In the ship's gymnasium until about 9:30. Then in the smoking room until I turned in. Several people saw me there, including yourselves." "Indeed," Poirot acknowledged. "One more question, if you please. Were you aware that Colonel Radley possessed a valuable collection of ancient coins?" A flicker of surprise crossed Barton's face. "Coins? There I knew he had a magpie's eye for souvenirs, but not specifically about any coins." Poirot thanked him, and we moved on. As we descended to the promenade deck, I voiced my thoughts. He certainly had motive, but his alibi for the critical time seems solid. "So it would appear," Poirot said, adjusting his hat against the wind. "Now, I think we should speak with Miss Papadopoulos." We found the archaeologist in the writing room composing a letter. Her pen paused mid-sentence as we approached, her dark eyes watchful. "Monsieur Poirot, I wondered when you would come." She set down her pen and folded her hands. "I suppose I am a suspect." "I am merely gathering information, mademoiselle. You had some acquaintance with Colonel Radley before this voyage." A shadow crossed her face. "We crossed paths in Cairo. I am with the University Archaeological Expedition. The Colonel expressed interest in our finds, professional interest, acquisitive interest." Her fingers drummed once on the table. "He wished to purchase certain artifacts. When I explained they were not for sale, he became difficult." "Difficult in what way?" I asked. She hesitated. "Let us say he was not accustomed to being refused. There was an incident at our dig site. Items went missing. I had no proof. But you suspected the Colonel? He appeared in England with items remarkably similar to those we lost." Her voice remained level, but a flush had crept into her cheeks. "Now, gentlemen, if there is nothing else, I have important correspondence to complete." As we walked along the corridor toward the first-class cabins, I sorted through the impressions of our morning's work. Both Barton and Miss Papadopoulos had reasons to dislike the Colonel, I observed, but neither seems quite the type for murder. Poirot's eyes twinkled. "And what type is that, my friend?" Before I could formulate a response, Miss Lemon approached from the direction of the main staircase, her normally composed features displaying unusual animation. "Mr. Poirot, I've just had the most interesting conversation with Mrs. Radley. I think you'll want to hear about it immediately." Poirot inclined his head. "Let us find somewhere private, Miss Lemon. I suspect what you have to tell us may shed considerable light on our case." The ship's bell rang out, marking the hour. Our investigation had only just begun, but already I sensed that beneath the civilized veneer of the SS Mesopotamia's first-class passengers lay currents of deception and danger, as unpredictable as the Mediterranean waters that surrounded us. Chapter 3. The Greek Connection. We convened in Poirot's cabin, a sanctuary of order, amid the growing tension aboard the SS Mesopotamia. Outside, the Mediterranean had darkened to slate gray, white caps visible through the porthole as the weather deteriorated. Inside, my friend had arranged the furniture with his customary precision, everything at right angles, personal items aligned with geometric exactitude. Miss Lemon perched on the edge of a chair, notebook open on her lap, not a hair out of place, not a crease in her sensible skirt. She embodied efficiency, personified. Mrs. Radley was most forthcoming after some gentle prompting. She began. The Colonel was her second husband. She was widowed young during the war. They had been married just over a year. "And the marriage? It was harmonious?" Poirot inquired. Miss Lemon's pencil tapped once against her notebook. "Hardly." She admitted quite freely, almost carelessly, that she married him for financial security. The Colonel was, she said, sufficiently wealthy to compensate for his other shortcomings. I raised an eyebrow, rather cold-blooded. She made no pretense of grief. Miss Lemon continued. When I expressed condolences, she merely shrugged and said, "These things happen." Then she asked how long before we reach Malta, and whether the authorities might delay her onward journey. Poirot stroked his mustache thoughtfully. Did she mention her plans after Malta? Athens. She claimed to have family connections there. Athens, Poirot repeated, his eyes narrowing. That is most interesting. Did you observe, Hastings, Our archaeologist friend is also Greek? The connection clicked into place. Miss Papadopoulos, you think she and Mrs. Radley might know each other? Before Poirot could answer, a sharp rap sounded at the door. The ship's captain entered, his uniform immaculate, despite the strain evident in his face. Forgive the interruption, Monsieur Poirot. I thought you should know we have performed a preliminary inventory of Colonel Radley's effects. His personal safe contained a collection of ancient coins, quite valuable by all appearances. The purser recognized several as rare Alexandrian tetradrachms. And these coins, they are all present? That's just it. According to a notation in the Colonel's journal, there should be 12. We found only 11. Poirot's eyes lit with that familiar gleam. Most illuminating. Captain, might I examine the Colonel's cabin again? Cabin 13 remained sealed, a steward standing guard outside. Inside, little had changed since the previous night, though the Colonel's body had been moved to a cold storage area. Poirot moved methodically through the space, examining each surface, each drawer, each item of clothing. What exactly are we looking for? I asked. The little details, Hastings. Always the little details. His attention fixed on a small desk where the Colonel's personal papers lay. Among them was a leather folder containing the ancient coins, each nestled in its own velvet compartment. Poirot studied them with interest. Beautiful workmanship, he murmured. And observe, an empty space where the 12th coin should be. As he replaced the folder, his hand paused at a small wastebasket beside the desk. Using his handkerchief, he carefully extracted something, a torn playing card. Only half remained, showing part of a red diamond and the letter K. The King of Diamonds, I said. Torn in half. Poirot slipped the fragment into an envelope. Let us continue our conversation with Miss Papadopoulos. We found her in the ship's small museum-like display room, examining a case of maritime artifacts. She turned as we entered, her expression guarded. Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings, have you made progress in your investigation? We are pursuing several lines of inquiry, Poirot replied smoothly. Tell me, Miss Papadopoulos, do you perhaps know Mrs. Radley from before this voyage? Her fingers, which had been tracing the outline of an ancient astrolabe on display, stilled. What makes you ask that? A professional curiosity. She hesitated, then squared her shoulders. We have never been formally introduced, but I knew of her. Athens' society is smaller than you might imagine. Had you mentioned this connection to no one? It seemed irrelevant. Her gaze was steady, but her right hand slipped into her pocket. Many people have connections to Greece. It's hardly unusual. Perhaps not, Poirot agreed. Do you by chance play cards, Miss Papadopoulos? The question, seemingly random, caused her to stiffen slightly. Occasionally? Why? A small matter. Poirot removed the torn card from his pocket. Does this belong to you, perhaps? She glanced at it, her expression carefully neutral. I believe I have a deck in my cabin. I haven't noticed any missing cards, but I haven't played since coming aboard. Would you mind if we examined your deck? Not at all. She led us to her cabin, a neat space adorned with several archaeological texts and a small bronze statue of Athena. From a drawer, she produced a deck of cards. Here you are. Poirot spread them across the desk, quickly sorting through. 51 cards, and observed the King of Diamonds is indeed missing. Miss Papadopoulos frowned. How strange. I hadn't noticed. And you have no explanation for how half of this card came to be in Colonel Radley's cabin. None whatsoever. A flush had crept into her cheeks. Unless we did meet briefly on deck yesterday afternoon. He was quite persistent in his attentions. Perhaps he took it then, though I can't imagine why. As we left her cabin, I glanced at Poirot. Do you believe her? His expression remained inscrutable. The truth, Hastings, like the ancient artifacts our friend studies, often lies buried under layers of deception. We must continue to dig. The ship's bell rang 3 times, marking the passing hours of our compressed investigation. With Malta approaching, time was running short, and the shadows of suspicion continued to lengthen across the SS Mesopotamia. Chapter 4. Professional differences. The weather continued to worsen as the afternoon progressed. The SS Mesopotamia pitched and rolled with increasing vigor, sending items sliding across tabletops and passengers clutching at railings. Poirot, who had never been an enthusiastic sailor, maintained a stoic demeanor, belied only by a slight greenish tinge to his complexion. "I think, Hastings," he remarked as we made our way carefully along the corridor, "that we should speak once more with Captain Barton. His history with Colonel Radley requires further illumination." We found Barton in the ship's chart room, bent over navigational maps with the first officer. Upon seeing us, he straightened his face, a careful mask of neutrality. "Monsieur Poirot, Captain Hastings, what can I do for you?" "A few more questions, if you would be so kind," Poirot replied. "In private, perhaps?" The first officer excused himself, leaving us alone amongst the maps and instruments. Outside the windows, the sea heaved against the glass, spray occasionally obscuring the view entirely. "This morning," Poirot began, "you mentioned a military operation in Palestine, for which Colonel Radley claimed undue credit. I would appreciate more details of this incident." Barton's fingers drummed once against the chart table before he stilled them. It was a night reconnaissance behind Turkish lines. High-risk mission, my plan, my men, my neck on the line. We brought back intelligence that changed the course of the entire campaign. And Colonel Radley? He was safely behind the lines the entire time. Barton's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching visibly at the hinge. But in his report to headquarters, he presented the operation as his own strategic initiative. By the time I learned what had happened, he'd received commendation from the general himself. "You protested, of course." I tried. His laugh held no humor. My word against his, he was a full colonel. I merely a captain. Besides, he'd been careful. The official orders had his signature, even though the actual planning was mine. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "A heavy burden to carry for so many years. I've made my peace with it." Barton turned to gaze out at the storm, or tried to. "One more question, if I may. The words of stolen glory, do they have any significance to you?" Barton's head snapped around, eyes narrowing. "Where did you hear that phrase?" "It is a matter pertinent to our investigation." The captain's shoulders tensed, then dropped as he exhaled slowly. "Yes, they have significance. I confronted Radley before he left the regiment. Told him he'd stolen the glory that rightly belonged to my men." He laughed it off. His voice dropped. "I wrote those words in a letter years later, when I heard he was publishing his memoirs. Told him if he included my operation in his book, I'd go public with the truth. And did you send this letter? 3 months ago. Never got a reply." As we left the chart room, the ship lurched suddenly. Poirot clutched at a handrail, his face momentarily betraying his discomfort. "Perhaps, mon ami," he suggested, "we might continue our investigation somewhere more stable." We made our way to the smoking room, which was largely deserted due to the worsening conditions. Settling into comfortable leather chairs, I voiced my thoughts. Barton certainly had motive. Stolen glory, then, that connects directly to the threatening note mentioned by the steward. Indeed, Poirot agreed, though consider this. If Captain Barton wished to murder Colonel Radley, why choose this particular moment? Why not years ago, when the wound was fresh? Before I could respond, a steward approached with a silver tray. "Message for Monsieur Poirot," he announced, presenting a folded note. Poirot read it quickly. "The captain requests our presence. The ship's officers have conducted a search of the passengers' cabins and have found something of interest. We found the captain in Barton's cabin, along with the first officer, and a visibly agitated Barton himself. This is outrageous," Barton was saying as we entered. "I demand to know on what grounds you searched my belongings." The captain turned to us. "Monsieur Poirot, we've been conducting routine security searches in light of the murder. In Captain Barton's cabin, we found this." He held up a sheet of notepaper, a draft of a threatening note, using the exact phrases, "stolen glory." Poirot accepted the paper, examining it carefully. The words were written in a hasty scrawl. "Your stolen glory will be your downfall. Justice comes to all men eventually." "It's not what you think," Barton insisted, a flush creeping up his neck. "Yes, I wrote it, but I never sent it. It was a draft, something I composed in anger after seeing Radley aboard. I thought better of it. And yet a note very similar to this was found among Colonel Radley's effects," the captain said. Barton's face paled. "Someone must have taken it from my cabin. I wrote it the first night out, then thought better of it and left it in my desk drawer." Poirot studied him intently. "Captain Barton, where were you yesterday between 4 and 5 in the afternoon?" "In the ship's gymnasium, then on deck for some air. Why? Can anyone confirm this?" Barton hesitated. "The gymnasium attendant saw me as for the deck. I walked alone." The captain frowned. "That's precisely when the steward noticed someone leaving the vicinity of what would later become Colonel Radley's cabin." "This is absurd," Barton protested. "I had no reason to go near the first-class cabins." Poirot's eyes narrowed slightly. "Tell me, Captain Barton, did you know about Colonel Radley's collection of ancient coins?" "I've already told you I didn't. Yet one of these coins is now missing, a valuable Alexandrian tetradrachma." "And you think I took it?" Barton's laugh was harsh. "Search my cabin thoroughly, then. You won't find any ancient coin." The captain nodded to the first officer, who began a methodical search of the cabin. Drawers were opened, clothes examined, even the mattress lifted from the bed. Finally, he shook his head. "Nothing, sir." A slight frown crossed Poirot's face. Most curious. As we left Barton's cabin, I glanced at Poirot. "You seem disappointed." "Not disappointed, Hastings. Intrigued. The pieces of our puzzle refuse to fit neatly together, and that, my friend, often indicates that we are looking at the wrong picture entirely." The ship's officer at the end of the corridor saluted crisply. "Monsieur Poirot, the captain asked me to inform you that we will be arriving at Malta within 2 hours. The local police have been notified and will board immediately upon docking." Poirot nodded his acknowledgement. Time was running short, and yet I sensed that the true solution to the mystery of Cabin 13 remained tantalizingly beyond our grasp. Chapter 5. Service and Secrets. The announcement that we would be reaching Malta within 2 hours lent a new urgency to Poirot's investigation. As we made our way through the narrow corridors of the SS Mesopotamia, the ship pitched less violently. We had entered more sheltered waters. "We must speak with the steward Hawkins," Poirot declared. "His role in this affair may be more significant than it first appeared." We located the purser who informed us that Hawkins was currently attending to duties in the ship's linen room. Following his directions, we descended to a lower deck where the crew quarters and service areas were located. The linen room, with its shelves of meticulously folded sheets and towels, embodied order and efficiency. Hawkins stood at a central table checking items against an inventory list. At our entrance, his pencil paused mid-stroke, his sallow face registering surprise. "Monsieur Poirot, sir, Captain Hastings, can I help you?" "A few questions, if you please," Poirot replied, running a finger along a shelf and examining it for dust. Finding none, he nodded slightly in approval. "You were assigned to Colonel Radley's cabin, yes?" "Yes, sir. I was responsible for cabins 9 through 15 on that deck, and you transferred his belongings from his original cabin to cabin 13. Hawkins's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed. "That's right, sir. Everything except his valuables, those he moved himself. The Colonel's valuable possessions. Did he mention what they were?" "He didn't specify, sir, just said he'd handle the important items personally." Hawkins' fingers fidgeted with his uniform button, though I did see him carrying a small leather folder from his safe. "The coins, no doubt," I murmured to Poirot. "When exactly did you complete the transfer of the Colonel's belongings?" Poirot continued. Hawkins frowned in concentration. "I started around 8 after dinner service began, finished most of it by 8:45. But the Colonel wanted his evening clothes pressed for the following day, so I took those to be pressed and returned them to the new cabin just after 9:30. "Which is when you encountered us on deck and asked for the time," Poirot observed. "That's right, sir. My watch had stopped at 9:15, most inconvenient. And when you returned to cabin 13 later, at approximately what time was that?" Hawkins' fingers now twisted a loose thread on his sleeve. "Must have been around 10:15, sir. I'd finished my other duties and wanted to make sure everything was satisfactory with the Colonel's new accommodations. Did you notice anything unusual in the corridor when you approached the cabin?" A look of concentration crossed Hawkins's face. "Well, there was water on the floor, just a few drops. I assumed someone had spilled a drink, so I wiped it up before knocking." Poirot's eyes lit up. "Ah, you noticed water. This is most significant." "Is it, sir?" Hawkins looked bewildered. "Most definitely." Poirot's mustache twitched slightly. "Tell me, how well did you know Colonel Radley's habits?" "Hardly at all, sir. This was only the 3rd day of the voyage. Yet you took particular care with his belongings, did you not? Everything arranged just so." A flush crept into Hawkins's pale cheeks. "I try to provide good service to all passengers, sir." "Of course, but I observed that you paid special attention to certain details. The Colonel's military decorations, for instance. You arranged them in precise order of precedence on his dinner jacket." Hawkins's eyes widened. "You noticed that, sir?" "I notice many things, mon ami. It suggests someone with knowledge of military protocols." "You served in the war, perhaps?" The steward's shoulders straightened almost imperceptibly. "Yes, sir. Royal Army Service Corps. Nothing glamorous like you gentlemen, but I did my bit. Under Colonel Radley, by any chance?" Hawkins's gaze dropped to the floor. "No, sir. Different theater entirely." Poirot nodded, his expression thoughtful. "One more question. Did you observe any of the ship's passengers near cabin 13 at unusual hours?" Hawkins hesitated. "Well, sir, I wouldn't want to speak out of turn. This is a murder investigation," I reminded him. Speaking out of turn may be precisely what's needed. Well, in that case, Hawkins lowered his voice. I did see Lady Westbrook outside that section of cabins yesterday afternoon. Seemed a bit lost, she did. Said she was looking for her own cabin, but hers is on the deck above. Most interesting, Poirot murmured. And what time was this? Around 4 o'clock, sir, I remember, because I was delivering afternoon tea to Miss Papadopoulos at the time. We thanked Hawkins and left him to his inventory. As we climbed the stairs back to the passenger decks, I shared my thoughts. Lady Westbrook hasn't figured prominently in our investigation thus far. Perhaps we've been overlooking her. Perhaps, Poirot agreed, though one must ask why the aristocratic Lady Westbrook would murder a man she had only just met. We found Miss Lemon in the ship's library, precisely organizing her notes. At our approach, she closed her notebook and adjusted her glasses. Mr. Poirot, I have completed the inquiries you requested. The ship's telephone operator confirms that Mrs. Radley placed a call to Athens yesterday afternoon, speaking in Greek for approximately 3 minutes. Excellent work, Miss Lemon. And the other matter. The purser's records show that Lady Westbrook and Colonel Radley were both passengers on the Alexandria Star 6 months ago, traveling from Southampton to Egypt. They were not mere strangers meeting for the first time on this voyage. Poirot's eyebrows rose. Ah, another piece falls into place. A ship's officer approached, cap in hand. "Excuse me, Monsieur Poirot. The captain asks that you join him immediately. We've apprehended someone attempting to dispose of an object overboard, an ancient coin matching the description of the one missing from Colonel Radley's collection. We hurried to the captain's cabin, where we found him standing over his desk. On a white handkerchief lay a tarnished silver coin, its surface bearing the profile of a long-dead ruler. Found in the possession of Vincent Hawkins, the captain announced grimly. The steward was attempting to drop it over the rail on the starboard side when the first officer spotted him. "Where is Hawkins now?" Poirot asked. "Under guard, in his quarters. He's claiming it was planted in his pocket. Says he only discovered it when changing his jacket and panicked." Poirot bent to examine the coin without touching it. "This is indeed a tetradrachm of considerable age and value. So we have our thief," I suggested, "and possibly our murderer." Poirot straightened, his face troubled. "Non, mon ami. What we have is another piece of a most complex puzzle, and I fear that someone is arranging those pieces to create a false picture." As we left the captain's cabin, the first glimpse of Malta appeared on the horizon, a smudge of land against the darkening sky. Our time was running short, but I sensed that Poirot was drawing closer to the truth hidden behind the cryptic clues of Cabin 13. Chapter 6. Matters of Time and Scent. The island of Malta grew larger on the horizon, its limestone fortifications catching the late afternoon sun. We had perhaps an hour before docking, and yet Poirot showed no signs of anxiety. Instead, he insisted we pay a visit to Lady Westbrook, who had thus far remained a peripheral figure in our investigation. We found her in the first-class lounge, taking tea with the air of one accustomed to the finer things in life. Diamonds glittered at her throat and wrists, catching the light with every movement of her bejeweled hands. At our approach, she set down her cup with deliberate precision. "Miss Poirot, I wondered when you would get around to me." Her voice carried the crisp authority of the English aristocracy. "Everyone else has been questioned, I understand." Poirot bowed slightly. "My apologies for the delay, Lady Westbrook. You are most perceptive. One doesn't survive in society without developing a certain awareness." She gestured to the empty chairs at her table. "Please join me. I presume this concerns poor Colonel Radley." As we seated ourselves, I noticed a distinctive scent, an oriental cologne, subtle but unmistakable. "You were acquainted with the Colonel before this voyage, I believe?" Poirot began. Lady Westbrook's heavily ringed fingers adjusted the pearl choker at her neck. "We traveled on the same ship to Egypt 6 months ago. Casual acquaintances, nothing more. Yet you expressed particular interest in his ceremonial dagger at dinner. I have an appreciation for fine metalwork. My late husband was something of a collector, and the Colonel's collection of ancient coins. Did that also interest you?" The faintest flicker crossed her face. "I wasn't aware he collected coins." "Most curious," Poirot murmured. "When the steward Hawkins observed you near cabin 13 yesterday afternoon, what was your purpose there?" Lady Westbrook's teacup paused halfway to her lips. "I was looking for my own cabin. I got turned around. On the wrong deck entirely, after 3 days aboard." She set the cup down with a slight clink against the saucer. "I'm not accustomed to these modern vessels. Everything looks the same." "Indeed," Poirot's eyebrows rose. "And yet you have traveled extensively by ship, according to the purser's records." A flush crept into Lady Westbrook's carefully powdered cheeks. "Very well. If you must know, I was looking for Colonel Radley. He had expressed interest in purchasing one of my brooches, a gold scarab with lapis inlay. I thought to show it to him before dinner, at 4 in the afternoon, when most first-class passengers would be at tea. I didn't wish to make a public display of a private transaction." Poirot nodded thoughtfully. "Lady Westbrook, might I inquire about your cologne? It has a most distinctive character." Her hand rose to her throat in a seemingly unconscious gesture. "Midnight, in Cairo, purchased during my recent visit. Do you find it pleasant?" "Most interesting," Poirot replied noncommittally. "Now, if you would excuse us, we have one more inquiry to make before our arrival in Malta." As we left the lounge, I glanced questioningly at Poirot. "The cologne, is that significant?" "Most significant, mon ami. Did you not detect that same scent in cabin 13 last night?" "Faint, but unmistakable." Before I could respond, Miss Lemon approached, a small object wrapped in her handkerchief. "Mr. Poirot, I've located it as you requested." The Colonel's pocket watch was in the personal effects being held by the purser. Poirot accepted the bundle carefully. Unwrapping it, he revealed a gold hunter case watch of excellent quality. He examined it closely, particularly the face and hands. "Observe, Hastings, what do you notice?" I peered at the timepiece. It stopped at 9:22. Precisely. Poirot's eyes gleamed, and yet when I asked Steward Hawkins the time last night, it was 9:27, and his watch had stopped at 9:15. The discrepancy in times, you think it's significant? I know it is. Poirot re-wrapped the watch carefully. Just as I know that the water droplets Hawkins observed outside cabin 13 are connected to both the cologne and this stopped watch, we made our way to the captain's cabin, where we found him reviewing documents with the first officer in preparation for our arrival in Malta. "Ah, Monsieur Poirot, have you made progress?" "The local authorities will board immediately upon docking, and they will expect answers." "I have several questions yet to resolve," Poirot replied. "Might I examine once more the inventory of Colonel Radley's possessions?" The captain handed over a typed list. Poirot scanned it quickly, his finger pausing at one entry. "The Colonel's shaving kit. It included a straight razor?" Yes, quite an elaborate one. Silver handle with his initials engraved. And the ceremonial dagger, has it been examined thoroughly? The ship's doctor looked it over. Death was caused by a single thrust to the heart. The dagger penetrated between the ribs with considerable force. Were there fingerprints? The captain shook his head. None usable. The handle was wiped clean. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. I should like to speak with Mrs. Radley once more before we dock. We found the colonel's widow in her cabin, packing her belongings with methodical efficiency. Unlike many of the first-class cabins which overflowed with personal items, hers was Spartanly neat. Madame, Poirot began, I apologize for the intrusion, but time grows short. I assume the Maltese police will want to question me. She folded a blouse with precise movements. I've nothing to hide, Monsieur Poirot. Then perhaps you can explain why you called Athens yesterday, speaking in Greek. Her hands stilled momentarily. I was confirming arrangements with family friends. I told you I have connections there. And your relationship with Miss Papadopoulos? Mrs. Radley's eyes narrowed slightly. I have no relationship with her. We've barely spoken. Yet you both speak Greek and have connections to Athens. Greece is hardly a large country, Monsieur Poirot. Coincidences happen. Indeed, they do. One final question, if I may. The key to Colonel Radley's cabin, did he keep it with him at all times? She frowned. I wouldn't know. Such mundane details were my husband's concern, not mine. As we left her cabin, the ship's engines changed their pitch. We were approaching the harbor. Poirot, I said urgently, we're nearly at Malta. Shouldn't you be preparing to present your conclusions to the authorities? His expression was serene. All in good time, mon ami. There is one more test I must conduct. Fetch Miss Lemon and meet me in cabin 13 in 10 minutes. When I arrived with Miss Lemon at the appointed time, we found Poirot examining the cabin's washstand with minute attention. Ah, you're here. Good. He straightened, adjusting his bow tie. I have arranged for all of our suspects to gather in the main lounge at 6 o'clock. There I shall reveal the truth behind the murder of Colonel Radley. You've solved it then? I asked. Poirot's fingers brushed his mustache. The final pieces are falling into place, Hastings. The water droplets, the cologne, the stopped watch, the position of the key. They tell a story quite different from what our murderer intended. Through the porthole, the ancient harbor of Valletta came into view, golden in the evening light. The time for answers had arrived. Chapter 7. The Widow's Tears. The main lounge of the SS Mesopotamia had been transformed from a place of leisure to one of tension. Outside the windows, the harbor of Valletta glowed golden in the evening light, as the ship maneuvered toward its berth. Inside, the ship's officers had assembled our suspects as requested: Mrs. Radley, Captain Barton, Miss Papadopoulos, Lady Westbrook, and the steward Hawkins, who was flanked by 2 crew members serving as guards. The captain addressed Poirot with barely concealed impatience. We'll be docking in 20 minutes, Monsieur Poirot. The Maltese authorities will board immediately. I hope you have something concrete to tell them. Rest assured, Captain, I do. Poirot surveyed the assembled group, his green eyes sharp and penetrating. Before I explain the events surrounding Colonel Radley's death, I must confirm one final detail. He turned to Mrs. Radley, who sat with perfect posture, her black mourning clothes immaculate. Madame, when did you last see your husband alive? Mrs. Radley's gloved fingers smoothed an invisible crease in her skirt. At dinner, naturally. I retired to my cabin with a headache while he went to the smoking room. You did not visit him in cabin 13 later that evening? Certainly not. Her voice remained steady, but I noticed a slight tension around her eyes. As I told you, I had a headache, I took a powder, and went to bed early. I see. Poirot turned abruptly to the steward. Mr. Hawkins, the cabin key. When you found the colonel's body, where precisely was the key to cabin 13? Hawkins blinked, caught off guard by the question. Why on the bedside table, sir? I remember it distinctly because I nearly knocked it over when I checked for the colonel's pulse. On the inside of the door, yes? Not inserted in the lock. That's right, sir, inside the room on the table. Poirot nodded, as if this confirmed something important. And now, Miss Lemon, if you would be so kind as to share what you discovered about the young officer aboard this ship, Lieutenant Reed, I believe. Miss Lemon consulted her notebook. Lieutenant James Reed, age 28, assigned to diplomatic duties in Cairo. He has been observed in frequent conversation with Mrs. Radley during the voyage. All eyes turned to the widow, whose complexion had paled slightly. Casual conversations only, she said stiffly. The lieutenant is a family connection. A family connection, Poirot repeated thoughtfully. Yet the steward who attends the deck chairs reports that on the first day of the voyage, before you knew you were being observed, you and the lieutenant were engaged in what appeared to be a most intimate conversation. Your hands touched. Words of affection were exchanged. Mrs. Radley's composure cracked slightly. What exactly are you implying, Monsieur Poirot? For the moment, nothing. I merely establish facts. Poirot's attention shifted to Miss Papadopoulos. The torn playing card found in Colonel Radley's cabin. You claimed it might have been taken during a brief encounter on deck, yet the card was torn precisely in half. An odd souvenir, would you not agree? The archaeologist's dark eyes met his steadily. I cannot explain the colonel's actions. Perhaps not. But can you explain why, when I examined the desk in your cabin, I found traces of the same adhesive used in the conservation of ancient artifacts traces that match exactly the residue found on the missing coin discovered in Steward Hawkins' possession? Miss Papadopoulos's shoulders stiffened. I work with such materials daily. It proves nothing. In isolation, perhaps not. Poirot turned to address the entire room. Ladies and gentlemen, the murder of Colonel Radley was not a simple crime of opportunity or passion. It was a carefully orchestrated performance, designed to disguise its true nature and purpose. The ship's engines slowed as we entered the final approach to the dock. Through the windows I could see harbor officials gathering on the quay. The colonel was not killed at the time we were led to believe, Poirot continued. The stopped watch, showing 9:22, was altered deliberately. Consider, when we encountered Steward Hawkins in the corridor, he asked us the time because his own watch had stopped at 9:15. Monsieur Poirot told him it was 9:27. Later, the colonel's watch is found stopped at 9:22. Why this discrepancy? Captain Barton frowned. Are you suggesting the murder occurred earlier or later than we thought? Earlier, Poirot said firmly. Much earlier. The water droplets observed by Hawkins outside cabin 13 were not, as we were meant to believe, evidence of a person leaving the scene after the murder. They were condensation from an ice bucket, used to slow the cooling of the body and confuse the time of death. Mrs. Radley's hand flew to her throat. This is absurd. Is it? Poirot fixed her with his penetrating gaze. When I examined the colonel's shaving implements, I noticed something curious. Though he had supposedly moved to cabin 13 only that evening, the soap in his shaving mug was completely dry. No man who shaved that morning, as the Colonel surely did, would have a perfectly dry shaving soap by evening. The room had grown utterly silent. The Colonel died much earlier in the day. I estimate between 4 and 5 in the afternoon. He was killed not in cabin 13, but in his original cabin. The body was then moved during the evening meal, when the corridors would be relatively empty, using the pretext of transferring his belongings to the new cabin. "But who?" I began. Poirot raised his hand. "The position of the key is most revealing. Found inside the room, on the bedside table. If the killer entered an unlocked cabin and surprised the Colonel, how did the key come to be there? No, the cabin was locked from the inside. The Colonel admitted his killer willingly." His gaze swept the room once more, coming to rest on Mrs. Radley. Her face had gone completely white, contrasting starkly with her black attire. "Madame," Poirot said softly, "the Colonel's cologne, the distinctive scent Lady Westbrook wears, midnight, in Cairo, was present in the cabin." Yet the Colonel himself wore no cologne, according to his valet in Cairo. A single tear traced down Mrs. Radley's cheek, smudging her carefully applied makeup. "Your accomplice wore that scent, did they not? The person who helped you move the body, who created the elaborate charade of the new cabin, who planted the evidence to implicate others." Poirot's voice remained gentle. "The person with whom you planned to share your husband's considerable fortune once you reached Athens." Mrs. Radley's composure finally shattered. Her shoulders sagged, and more tears followed the first. "It wasn't supposed to happen," she whispered. "Marcus discovered my letters to James. He confronted me, threatened to disinherit me. He became violent. I only meant to defend myself." The ship gave a slight shudder as it connected with the dock. Outside, the Maltese police were visible on the quay, waiting to board. The truth of cabin 13 had been revealed, but I sensed that Poirot was holding back one final revelation: the identity of Mrs. Radley's accomplice in this tragic affair. Chapter 8. Revelations in Cabin 13. The Maltese police had boarded the SS Mesopotamia with the brisk efficiency of men accustomed to dealing with crimes in port cities. Their chief inspector, a compact man with shrewd eyes and a clipped mustache, listened attentively as Poirot requested one final hour to complete his investigation before Mrs. Radley was formally charged. "I require all our suspects to accompany me to cabin 13, Poirot explained. "There, the full truth will be revealed." And so, our somber procession made its way through the ship's corridors. Mrs. Radley walked with the hollow-eyed resignation of one whose secrets have been partially exposed. Yet I sensed she still held something back. Behind her came Captain Barton, his military bearing intact, despite the tension evident in his clenched jaw. Miss Papadopoulos followed, her dark eyes watchful, while Lady Westbrook maintained a regal distance, her jewels catching the light with each step. Hawkins, still under guard, completed our party. Cabin 13 remained much as it had been on the night of the murder, preserved for investigation. Poirot positioned himself near the washstand, his back straight, his egg-shaped head tilted slightly as he surveyed the assembled suspects. "What I am about to reveal," he began, "is a story of greed, deception, and a plot of considerable ingenuity. Mrs. Radley has admitted to killing her husband, claiming self-defense. But there is more, much more, to this affair." The widow's gaze dropped to the floor, her hands trembling slightly. The Colonel's murder was indeed committed in the afternoon, as I explained earlier, but it was not, as Mrs. Radley claims, an impulsive act of self-protection. Poirot's voice hardened. It was a calculated murder, planned in conjunction with an accomplice. "Who?" Captain Barton demanded. "Who helped her?" "Patience, Captain." Poirot's eyes swept the room. "Consider first the evidence planted to mislead us. The threatening note about stolen glory found among the Colonel's effects clearly meant to implicate you. The missing coin discovered in Stuart Hawkins's possession. The torn playing card connecting to Miss Papadopoulos, all designed to scatter suspicion." Lady Westbrook's bejeweled hand rose to adjust her necklace. "This is all very dramatic, Monsieur Poirot. But what does it have to do with the rest of us? The woman has confessed. Indeed, she has, partially, but observe. Mrs. Radley claimed her husband became violent when he discovered her relationship with Lieutenant Reed, yet the Colonel's body showed no signs of struggle beyond the fatal wound. His hands bore no defensive marks, his knuckles no bruising consistent with striking his wife. Mrs. Radley's head snapped up. "I never said he struck me. He threatened to, but you implied it." Poirot's finger wagged gently, "just as you implied that Lieutenant Reed was your lover and accomplice." He turned suddenly toward Lady Westbrook. "A clever misdirection, was it not, Madame?" The aristocrat's face drained of color. "I don't know what you mean. The cologne, Lady Westbrook, midnight in Cairo. Most distinctive, present in the Colonel's cabin, yet he wore no cologne. Lieutenant Reed, when I discreetly inquired, favors a completely different scent, but you, Madame, you wear it constantly." The room had gone utterly still. "I examined the Colonel's safe after his belongings were transferred," Poirot continued. "Inside was a small notebook recording his antiquities transactions. The most recent entry mentioned acquiring a scarab brooch with lapis inlay from P.W., with a substantial sum noted. Your initials, Lady Westbrook, Patricia Westbrook." The aristocrat's composure cracked. "That proves nothing." "We had a business transaction, nothing more. Perhaps. But when I asked about the Colonel's coin collection, you claimed to know nothing of it. Yet the transactions notebook clearly shows you sold him 3 of those coins during your previous voyage together. Why lie about such a detail?" Lady Westbrook's face had become a mask of rigid control. Mrs. Radley watched her with growing horror. "Patricia, tell them they're wrong," she whispered. "The plan was simple but effective," Poirot said, his voice cutting through the tension. "Lady Westbrook and Mrs. Radley met 6 months ago during the Colonel's previous voyage. They formed an alliance, business at first, then personal. The Colonel's fortune would be shared between them after his convenient death." He moved to the bedside table. "The position of the key tells us much. Left inside on the table. Only someone with their own key could have locked the cabin from outside afterward. Only a spouse would naturally possess such a key." The police inspector stepped forward. "You're saying these women conspired together?" "Precisely. Mrs. Radley lured her husband to his original cabin that afternoon, where Lady Westbrook was waiting. Together, they killed him using his own ceremonial dagger. They then carefully planted evidence implicating others before moving the body to cabin 13 during dinner, when the corridors would be relatively empty. Lady Westbrook's aristocratic reserve finally shattered. It was her idea, all of it." She pointed a trembling finger at Mrs. Radley. She said he was cruel to her, that he deserved to die. She promised we would go to Greece together with his money. Patricia. Mrs. Radley's face contorted with betrayal. You swore you'd never... And you swore the plan was foolproof. Lady Westbrook's voice rose hysterically. You said no one would suspect us. No one would have. Poirot interjected quietly. Had it not been for the water droplets outside the cabin, melted ice used to slow the body's cooling, had it not been for the discrepancy in the watches, had it not been for the dry shaving soap and the distinctive cologne. In a movement so sudden it startled us all, Lady Westbrook lunged toward the washstand, seizing the Colonel's straight razor that Poirot had deliberately left there. Her face transformed into a mask of desperate fury as she slashed wildly at Poirot. I moved without thinking, throwing myself forward to protect my friend. A searing pain across my forearm told me I'd intercepted the blade. Captain Barton and the police officers surged forward, subduing Lady Westbrook as she screamed accusations at her former accomplice. It's over, Poirot said softly, as the police led the two women away. He examined my arm with concern. You are injured, mon ami. Just a cut, I assured him, though blood seeped through my sleeve. Nothing compared to what might have happened. The inspector shook his head in amazement. How did you know it was the two of them together? The little gray cells, they never fail, Poirot replied, his customary modesty momentarily abandoned. And perhaps in the end it was fitting that the truth should finally emerge in cabin 13, the number so feared by Monsieur Fraser for its associations with misfortune. As a doctor attended to my wound, I reflected that superstition had indeed played its part in this tragic affair. Had Mr. Fraser not refused cabin 13, had the Colonel not been moved there, perhaps the carefully orchestrated murder might have escaped detection. 13, the number of bad luck, not for Poirot, whose brilliant deductions had illuminated the darkest corners of human deception, but certainly for the Colonel's killers, whose journey would end not in the freedom of Athens, but in the confines of prison. Thank you for joining me on Café Stories for the Cabin 13 Mystery. If you enjoyed Poirot's Mediterranean adventure, please hit the like button and subscribe for more classic detective tales. Until next time, remember, even the most ordinary numbers conceal the most extraordinary crimes.